Now, in talking about defense, in other words, when my opponent has me in a head and arm position, what do I want to do? Naturally, the person that has the head and arm is in a position of great advantage relative to the person that has that position on them. But think about what we want to do offensively. I want to keep my opponent's weight down and forward. So his head down, his butt up, his weight forward. That's important. Also, generally, too, I want to keep at pretty much an angle such that we're pretty parallel here. I certainly don't want to be at an angle out here. Okay. I want to be pretty much over his head, keeping my weight on his head, keeping his weight down in front and his hips up. In addition to keeping Colby's weight forward and his head down, with his weight again towards his head or towards his hand, I also want to make sure that I keep my elbows in so that he doesn't have good purchase on them. Also, I'm going to do my best to kind of stretch. When I have in this position here, I try to keep his head kind of pulled downward and away from his back here. Okay, the more I can kind of stretch his neck out, typically, the more trouble he has keeping it bold and keeping it strong. Now, conversely, for me to defend this position, and again, if Colby has me in a head and arm type position or a front headlock type position, I'm not in good shape and I need to adjust to try to get out of that position quickly because he has a great advantage. But what I can do, at least to attempt to neutralize that advantage, is when Colby has the head and arm, first things I want to think about is keeping my weight back for the most part. Naturally, I've got to worry about a knee tap if I keep my weight too far back, but I definitely don't want him pulling my weight forward, so I need to make a frame here. Next, what I want to do is I want to do anything I can to keep his arm forward, his elbow forward. I want to keep my head up. I want to blow my neck, and I want to keep, as best I can, a good solid frame here. If my neck is head is stretched out or my neck is out, I'm not quite as powerful as if my neck is bowed. Also, too, I would prefer having a slight angle if I can get it. Now, one little point I want to make that will make life easier if you get in this position in terms of defending it. You'll notice when Colby has the head and arm on me, where is his shoulder relative to mine? His shoulder's on top. Notice, too, his elbows are fairly out of reach for me, not in good shape here, and he's going to be tugging me forward. Now, as I get my weight back, and as I can attempt to attack his arm here, what I'm going to try to do eventually is try to bump and move around to where, if you'll notice what I did with my shoulder, I pulled his shoulder down and got on top, to here. If I can get my shoulder on top, even if he's got a good grip, tighten up a little bit here, all of a sudden, I take a lot of the pressure off. Notice where my shoulder is on top of his shoulder now. Notice where his shoulder is on top of my shoulder now. And that's where part of the battle is here. It's being able to adjust our shoulder position. Colby wants his shoulder on top of mine. I want to try to get my shoulder on top of his. And I'm going to get that position. I'm going to keep it as best I can. Notice, too, if I can get a slight angle, I'm going to do that as well, as opposed to keeping him out straight over my head. So, I want to keep my head bold. I want to keep my weight back, being conscious of a knee tap here. And I can prevent that a little bit by getting my shoulder on top of his shoulder. I'm going to control this position a lot better than if I let him keep his shoulder on top of my shoulder in this position and his elbows out of reach. So, I need to get good position here by keeping my neck bold, keeping my weight relatively back. I try to get my shoulder on top of his shoulder, even if he holds on to the grip. Hold on to the grip here. From this position, I want to keep my shoulder on top. If you can adjust that position so you get your shoulder on top, you have a fairly good chance of getting out. And that's one of the things I concentrate a lot. Part of that just kind of bumping and fighting to try to get enough space to do that. Naturally, all things being equal, Colby has the advantage in that position. But those are basically the things I'm thinking of so I don't get destroyed in that position. Another thing that's important is keeping my elbows back. If Colby gets me in the head and arm, I don't want to let him get this elbow out in front from the get-go. That makes it very difficult for me. So if he gets a head on, immediately I keep my elbows back, both elbows back. That's important. Notice I'm trying to get on top with my shoulder. He gets the head and arm, I bull my neck, my elbows come back because I don't want my head down and I don't want my arm getting continually pulled further and further forward and over my own head here, where I'm going to have tremendous leverage against my upper body here that I'm not going to be able to support. So I want to keep my elbows in. That's crucial. So when I'm fighting, my elbows stay in, because the more he gets his elbows, or my elbows, past that 90-degree plane from my spine, the worse I'm at. Once it gets out in front, it's very difficult. Once it gets out, it's very difficult. Here, I've got some fight left in me, and I've got some ability, whereas here, my odds decrease precipitously. One other thing is that frequently in this position, I'll help support myself here. I'll help support myself with my hand, as opposed to just hanging on here. Because if I hang on right here and Colby pulls me forward, I've got nothing to support myself. I've got no frame. However, if as I'm fighting, I keep my elbows back and I get control, if he pulls me forward, now I have a little bit of a post here, especially if I can keep working to get my shoulder on top of his shoulder. I get an increasingly better position and shape here. Whereas if I just hang here and Colby pulls forward, I've got nothing to support myself. Part of this is learning to do all this dynamically, because as he's fighting, I'm going to be adjusting my shoulder position, he's going to be tugging me forward, and so part of it is just getting a sensitivity to trying to get my elbow or my shoulder on top, keeping my elbows back, getting the frame, getting a slight angle when I can. So it's not just a situation of technique, but it's learning the position by developing some sensitivity to what your opponent is trying to do to you, which is typically to pull you forward and down. Similarly, when you're on your feet, and my opponent gets me in the head and arm, I want to continue with a similar type of thing. Keeping my head up, my elbows back, and I want to keep my head bulled as best as possible. Of course, in mixed martial arts situation, I'm incredibly vulnerable there to getting popped with knees. But for grappling, that's not such a terrible position, presuming I can maintain it. Because as Colby is trying to get me down and get me forward, if I can get my head through here, I'm in good shape for a fireman's carry. Okay? As well as a couple other things, and I'm not going to get into that so much, but my main point is keeping neck bulled, elbows back, controlling his elbow. In other words, I want to keep his elbow forward and mine back. He wants to keep his elbow back from his perspective and my elbow forward. So I'm going to keep my elbows in, my head bulled, tight here. I'm going to attack that arm to try to get my shoulder on top as best I can. I'll be moving around. If I can, I'll push into him. I might go fireman's carry, for example. Okay, so there is some things in this position that might be a little bit more favorable than when I'm down to the ground, because I'm not nearly as mobile here. Again, Colby gets 2-on-1 in this position. I want to keep my head up as best as possible, and I want to try to get my shoulder on top.